Welcome to the Lost Sci-Fi Story channel. If you're ready, let's begin today's story.
The recycled air on Meridian Station smelled, on its best days, like the memory of a forest that had never actually existed. The environmental engineers responsible for the station's atmospheric processing had apparently decided, at some point in the station's early operational history, that the 17,000 civilians living aboard would find comfort in a faint undertone of pine, and had been pumping this manufactured olfactory optimism through the ventilation systems ever since. Elias Vorn had lived in Housing Block 9C for 4 years, and he had stopped noticing the pine smell approximately 3 years and 11 months ago, which he considered one of the genuine victories of his adult life. He was sitting at his grading table when the morning cycle began, the station's overhead panels shifting from their nighttime amber into the particular blue-white that the designers had calibrated to mimic a sunrise on a planet that most of the station's residents had never visited. The light came up slowly, as it always did, and Elias watched it the way he watched most things in the morning, without fully registering it. His attention distributed somewhere between the student composition on the table in front of him and the cup of coffee beside it, which had been hot approximately 40 minutes ago, and was now a study in optimistic self-deception. The composition belonged to a boy named Tomas, age 10, who had been tasked with writing 8 bars of original melody, and had instead written what appeared to be the same 3 bars repeated with increasing confidence, as though repetition itself were a structural argument. Elias had circled it in pencil and written beside it, "This is technically a valid compositional choice. Minimalism is a recognized form. However, I suspect minimalism was not your intention, and intention matters." He paused, looked at the ceiling for a moment, then added, "Please try again. Your first instinct had something in it. Find it." This was, in its entirety, how Elias Vorn understood his work. He was not a man who had ever expected to end up on a civilian station 3 transit jumps from the nearest planetary surface, teaching the children of diplomats and engineers and station administrators how to coax melody from instruments that most of them had initially approached with the wary suspicion normally reserved for medical procedures. He had studied at the Korvath Conservatory on Theshan Station, had graduated with distinctions in both compositional theory and pedagogy, and had spent the first 6 years of his career imagining that he would eventually find his way to one of the major concert academies in the course systems. Then life had made several decisions that he had not been consulted about, and he had made several decisions in response that he could not entirely defend in retrospect, and the sum of these events had deposited him here, in a set of rooms that smelled like invented pine, teaching children who ranged from genuinely talented to heroically indifferent, and he had discovered, somewhere in the 2nd year of this arrangement, that he did not actually want to be anywhere else. The rooms were his. That was not a small thing. The music stand near the window held compositions in 3 different handwriting styles. The synthesizer along the east wall bore the particular marks of an instrument that was used rather than displayed. A star chart hung beside the door, given to him by a student named Petra who had made it herself using the station's public mapping interface, and had presented it to him with the solemn gravity of someone conferring a significant honor, which in her 9-year-old understanding she was. Elias had hung it immediately and had genuinely forgotten to think about whether it matched anything else in the room, which was why it didn't, and why this had long since stopped mattering. His neighbor 2 doors down, a woman named Dr. Calloway, who studied microbial ecosystems and apparently processed scientific frustration through percussion, had begun her morning practice session. Elias recognized the pattern: 3 rapid strikes, a pause, 2 slower ones, then a sequence he had privately cataloged as the sound of a grant application being rejected in real time. He had never mentioned this theory to her. Some things were better as internal observations. He was refilling the coffee when his mind drifted, as it occasionally did without instruction, to the posting on Tarsi's 4. 2 years ago, stationed at the colony's Multicultural Education Center under a coalition teaching exchange program. 43 students across 6 species represented, which had required him to learn, with some urgency, that the standard human approach to rhythm instruction was built on assumptions so deeply embedded in his own nervous system that he had never thought to examine them until they simply failed to function. One student in particular, Savara, he didn't know her family name. The diplomatic cohort children were registered under their parents' posting codes for privacy reasons, which he had found bureaucratically irritating and now, in retrospect, understood. She had sat in the third row with the particular stillness of someone who was concentrating so hard that movement had become a luxury she couldn't afford, and she had looked at the keyboard in front of her with an expression he had taken weeks to correctly identify. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't disinterest. It was the expression of someone standing outside a door and being unable to locate the handle while being absolutely certain that they wanted what was on the other side. 3 extra sessions. 3 notes. On the last day she had played them in sequence, and the class had gone quiet, and Elias had written in his notes that evening, S found the handle. He was still holding the coffee when the door chime activated. He checked the time. No lesson scheduled. He crossed the apartment with the pencil still in his hand, past the synthesizer, past Petra's star chart, past the chair that announced every visitor with a sound like a small instrument meeting an untimely end, and opened the door. The pencil hit the floor. He did not hear it. She was still standing in the doorway when Elias remembered that he was a person, and that persons typically responded to the presence of other persons with something more communicative than suspended paralysis. He had, by his own internal accounting, been standing motionless for approximately 4 seconds, which does not sound like a significant duration until you are the one experiencing it, while the most documented combatant in coalition history waits on the other side of your door frame with the patient stillness of something that has never once in its life needed to rush. He said, "Your," and then stopped, because the sentence had several possible completions and none of them were appropriate. Sova or Rathvel waited. "You can come in," Elias said, and then, because his mouth had apparently decided to continue operating without consulting the rest of him, added, "I should mention the second chair makes a sound when you sit in it. Like it's structural, not a warning system. I've just never gotten around to fixing it." She looked at the chair. It was a perfectly ordinary station-issue chair that had, over 4 years of use, developed an acoustic personality entirely its own. She looked at it with the same quality of attention that military historians had described her applying to fortified positions, and the chair, to its credit, remained exactly where it was and made no sound at all, as though it had decided this was not the engagement it wanted. She entered the apartment. Elias had the immediate and specific experience of his rooms becoming a different kind of space without changing in any physical respect. The ceiling height was the same. The walls had not moved. The synthesizer was where it had always been, and Petra's star chart was still hung at the slight angle he had never corrected. Nothing had changed except that there was now a person in the room whose presence operated on a different register than ordinary presence, the way certain frequencies are felt before they are heard, and Elias' nervous system was filing a detailed report about this that he was doing his best to set aside. She stopped near the music stand. She looked at the student compositions pinned there with an attention that was genuinely difficult to interpret, not dismissive, not confused, but thorough in the way that everything she apparently did was thorough. Elias watched her study Tomas's 3-bar minimalist argument, and had the profound and slightly absurd experience of hoping she would not ask him to explain it, because he wasn't sure his current cognitive state was equal to defending the pedagogical value of a 10-year-old's accidental minimalism to someone whose Wikipedia entry had its own dedicated server cluster. "Savara," she said. The word landed in the middle of the apartment and reorganized everything around it. Elias felt something shift in his chest, not alarm, but recognition, the specific interior movement of a connection being made between a present moment and a memory he had not known was still sitting close to the surface. "You're her mother," he said, and his voice had returned to its normal register, which he considered a modest personal achievement given the circumstances. "Yes." She did not sit. She stood with the particular economy of someone who had learned through long practice that stillness was not the absence of readiness, but one of its more sophisticated expressions. And she looked at him with the amber gold eyes and their independent pupils, and Elias had the sudden practical thought that he should offer her something. Because this was still his apartment, and he had been raised by people who believed that hospitality was not optional. "I'm going to make coffee," he said. "I realize that I understand if that's not." He stopped. "Would you like coffee?" Something shifted at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, something adjacent to it. "Yes," she said, which was either genuine preference or the most efficient way to end that sentence. And Elias decided it didn't matter which because the act of making coffee gave him something to do with his hands, which were currently in urgent need of occupation. He moved to the kitchen unit and began the process while she remained near the music stand, and she began to speak in the measured, precise standard of someone who had learned the language for tactical purposes and used it accordingly, without decoration, but without coldness either, functional in the way that good tools are functional, which is to say built with care for a specific purpose. She told him about Sevara. She told him in fragments, not because the story was incomplete, but because she was a person who released information at the rate she had assessed it was needed, and she had assessed that he would follow the sequence without requiring every transition to be explained. Her daughter was 11. Her daughter had attended the Multicultural Education Center on Tarsi's 4 during a diplomatic posting that had lasted 14 months. Her daughter had come home in the final weeks of that posting with something she had not had before, something that did not appear in any of the developmental assessments Sova had been filing since Sevara's birth, with the thoroughness of someone who approached parenthood with the same systematic attention she applied to everything else. "She plays 3 notes," Sova said, "every night before sleep." Elias set the coffee cups on the counter and turned around. "She has done this for 2 years, Sova continued. Her sleep metrics are measurably better on the nights she plays them. Her cortisol analogs reduce. Her recovery cycles improve." A pause. "I have had this data for 2 years and I cannot explain it. I have consulted 3 separate specialists in multispecies developmental neurology, and they have offered me frameworks that are technically accurate and completely useless." Another pause, different from the first, not tactical but something closer to honest. "I came to find the teacher." Elias looked at her. "I came," she said, "because I need to understand what you gave her that I cannot quantify. And because I am her mother. And because those 2 things are not as separate as my career has sometimes encouraged me to believe." The coffee finished cycling. Elias poured both cups. He carried them across the room and held one toward her, and she took it. And they stood in his small apartment surrounded by student compositions and the faint manufactured smell of a forest that did not exist. And outside in the corridor, Dr. Calloway struck something twice in what sounded like either a breakthrough or a total collapse, and neither of them acknowledged it, because some moments deserve to be held still for exactly as long as they need. Elias had explained music to many people over the course of his career. He had explained it to children who held their instruments like weapons, and to children who held them like wounded birds. He had explained it to a station administrator who wanted to understand why the school's music program required a budget line, and he had explained it once, memorably, to a coalition education inspector who had asked whether music was strictly necessary given that mathematics covered pattern recognition adequately. A question that had required Elias to spend 45 seconds looking at a point on the wall before he trusted himself to answer. He had never, in any of these explanations, been required to start from the position that sound itself was neutral territory. He started there now. Your species didn't develop music, he said, not as a question, because she had given him enough in the second conversation to understand the shape of the absence. Sound was information, threat information mostly. Primarily, she said. She was holding the coffee cup with both hands, not in the way people hold cups for warmth, but in the way people hold things when they want something to do with their hands while their mind is working. Elias recognized this because he did the same thing, and finding a behavioral overlap between himself and the Blade's sovereign was the kind of discovery that required a moment of quiet private processing. Our communication developed through other channels, vibrational, postural, scent-based during certain states, though that particular system has become largely vestigial in urbanized populations. A beat. We find heavy bass frequencies uncomfortable. Coalition concert halls are inadvisable. I'll note that down, Elias said. The corner of her mouth moved again. He was beginning to map that expression. It appeared specifically when something landed in a register she hadn't expected, and it lasted approximately 1.5 seconds before her face returned to its default of controlled assessment. He was, without quite deciding to, cataloging it the way he cataloged the particular ways his students held tension in their shoulders when a passage was about to defeat them. He tried to explain what music was, and ran almost immediately into the problem he had anticipated, which was that every explanatory framework he had ever used assumed, at its foundation, that the person he was speaking to already knew what sound felt like from the inside. He started with emotion. Music organizes feeling into something external. He said, something you can return to, a container for states that would otherwise have no address. She listened with the quality of attention that made him feel every word was being held up to light and examined from multiple angles before being set down in whatever internal architecture she used for new information. She asked, "What does it contain that language cannot?" He opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at his synthesizer for a moment, genuinely consulting it as though it might help, and then said, "I usually explain this part with a drum and better visual aids. The stillness, the shift in eye focus, the 1.5 seconds, then I have time." Elias got up and crossed to the synthesizer and brought it to the table between them, which was slightly awkward logistically, because the table was not designed for this purpose, and the synthesizer's power cable only just reached, and there was a brief and undignified period of cable management that he chose not to think about too carefully given his audience. He set the instrument down. He looked at the keys for a moment the way he always did before demonstrating something, not for performance, but because he genuinely needed a second to locate the right entry point. He played 3 notes, the same 3 he had taught Sevara. The effect on Sova was immediate and visible, and she did not attempt to conceal it, which he understood later meant she trusted him enough not to, or had decided concealment was not the relevant response. Her pupils contracted simultaneously, both of them together, the first time he had seen that happen, and her shoulders moved in a small involuntary adjustment, and she held very still for a moment with the particular stillness of someone whose nervous system has filed a report marked urgent and is waiting to see whether the higher brain overrules it. "Your biology flagged that as threat adjacent," he said quietly. "Yes," she said. "It passed." A pause. "It took Sevara several months for it to pass." "I know," he said, and something in his voice must have carried the weight of what that knowledge meant. What it meant about what the child had done, the neurological work she had undertaken to build an entirely new relationship with sound against the current of everything her body expected. Because Sova looked at him with an attention that was different from the attentiveness she had been giving him all morning. More direct, more weighted. "You understood this at the time?" she asked, "on Tarsi's 4. "Not completely," he said, with the honesty the question deserved. "I knew she was working harder than the other students. I knew it was costing her something. I didn't have the full framework for why until now, actually. You've just explained something I've been holding as an incomplete understanding for 2 years. She absorbed this. Outside, the station's mid-morning maintenance cycle activated, and somewhere in the ventilation above them, something clicked and recalibrated, and the manufactured pine smell shifted almost imperceptibly into what the environmental log would have described as morning forest variant B, which was identical to morning forest variant A, except for a slightly more pronounced cedar undertone that no one had ever consciously noticed. The station lived around them, indifferent and mechanical and constant. "May I ask you something?" Elias said, and waited for her nod before continuing, because some questions needed permission. "When she plays them now, the 3 notes are you in the room?" A stillness that had nothing to do with threat assessment. "Sometimes." "What does it do to you?" The question sat in the space between them for long enough that he thought she might not answer it. She looked at the synthesizer. She looked at the keys he had just played, which were still faintly warm from contact, though she couldn't have known that from where she was sitting. "It does something," she said finally. "I cannot classify it correctly. The classification systems I have available were not built for it." She looked up at him. "That is the first time in 40 years that I have had an experience I cannot classify." Elias thought about that for a moment with the full weight it deserved. "Would you like to try?" he said, and nodded toward the keys. She looked at the synthesizer for a long time. Then she said, "I will consider the tactical approach." Elias, who had spent the previous evening preparing 3 different approaches to the first lesson, and had discarded all of them by midnight in favor of something simpler, said, "Put 1 finger on the key I show you. Don't press it yet. Just feel where it is." She looked at the synthesizer. She looked at her own hand, the long fingers, the extra joint visible when she extended them fully, with the expression of someone receiving intelligence on unfamiliar terrain. Then she placed 1 finger on the key he indicated, and the careful deliberateness with which she did it, the absolute seriousness, was so completely without self-consciousness that something in Elia's chest did the same thing it had done years ago on Tarsi's 4, when a child had found the handle. "Now," he said, "press it." The note filled the apartment. Single, clean, unambiguous. It lasted 3 seconds before she lifted her finger with the precise timing of someone who had been told nothing about duration and had made an independent assessment. Her pupils contracted and released in the cycle he had come to recognize as her nervous system filing, and then dismissing a threat report, and she held still for a moment with that quality of interior work visible in the set of her jaw. "Again," he said. She pressed it again. This time she held it a half-second longer. He said nothing. On the 3rd repetition she held it longer still, and on the 4th something changed in her posture, a fractional release of tension across her shoulders, so small that he would not have caught it if he had not spent 15 years reading the bodies of people learning to hear themselves for the first time. "What changed?" he said, not as a question because he already knew, but because he wanted her to have the language for it. She considered for a moment. "The second time I knew what was coming," she said. "My system did not need to assess it." "That's the beginning of music," Elias said. "Right there, that exact thing." She looked at him with an attention that had a different quality than her earlier attentiveness, less evaluative, more something he didn't have a clean word for. He was developing, he realized, a whole new internal vocabulary for her expressions, the way you develop vocabulary for any language you commit to learning seriously. They worked for 2 hours. He did not rush the 3 notes. He did not rush the transition between them. When she played the first 2 in sequence, and stopped with the precision of someone who had determined that the 3rd required additional tactical consideration before deployment, he waited with the patience that was perhaps the only thing he had ever been genuinely gifted at, the patience that had nothing performative in it. That was simply the quality of someone who believed the next thing would come when it was ready, and not 1 moment before. When she played all 3 in sequence for the first time, She set her hands in her lap and did not speak for a long moment. Outside, the station's early afternoon cycle shifted the overhead lighting by approximately 3 degrees warmer. The environmental system's interpretation of the hour when planetary surfaces caught the sun at its most generous angle. A daily small fiction that Elias had stopped noticing years ago and now, suddenly, noticed. She plays these, Sova said, not a question, a thing being understood from a new position. Every night, he said, according to your data. According to my data. Something in the way she repeated it, not mechanical, but weighted, as though the words meant more now than the first time she had used them. I have 14 days remaining. I know. That is not enough time to, she stopped, reorganized. What is a realistic objective? Elias thought about this with the honesty it required. You won't play anything you'd call music in 14 days, he said. What you might do is build enough familiarity with sound as information, rather than threat that when Savara plays for you, you can be present for it instead of processing it. That's different from performing, but it might be more useful. She was quiet for long enough that the maintenance drone passed in the corridor again. Its navigational tone, now so familiar to him that he barely registered it. Her pupils moved, contracted slightly, released. He watched her body decide in real time that the sound was known. That, she said, would be sufficient. But on the 14th day, with 1 day remaining before her briefing, she played the 3 notes from memory without looking at the keys, and Elias realized only afterward that he had been holding his breath. Not with anxiety, but with the specific suspended attention of a teacher in the moment before a student arrives somewhere they have been working toward together. The moment that justifies every slow hour, every patient repetition, every session that ended without visible progress and contributed to it anyway invisibly. He let the breath out. She set her hands in her lap. The apartment held the note a moment longer than it had actually sounded, the way rooms do when something real has just occurred in them. She'll want to hear you play them, Elias said. I am aware. A pause. I am not certain I will be able to maintain the same quality of stillness when it is her and not a practice context. That's not a flaw in the method, he said. That's the point of it. But she looked at him with the full weight of those amber eyes, and he had understood for days. But now it was complete, that she had come to his door looking for a quantifiable explanation, and had found something she was going to spend a great deal more time with than 14 days. Something that had no tactical framework and required one built entirely from scratch and would take whatever time it took, which was fine, which was exactly the nature of the thing. She stood. She folded the military chair with one clean motion and held it under one arm, and she looked at him in the way she had looked at nothing else in his apartment, not assessing, not cataloging, but acknowledging, which from her was its own kind of language. You told me, she said, that wanting to understand is the only qualification you require. Yes, I want to understand, she said, considerably more than I currently do. Elias nodded. Same time next deployment leave, he said. She moved to the door. She paused at the threshold, and she looked back at the synthesizer the way people look at things that have recently changed their relationship with the world. And then she looked at him, and the corner of her mouth moved in the expression he had spent 14 days learning, the one that lasted 1.5 seconds and meant something had landed in a place she hadn't expected to find anything. The chair in the corridor, she said, is that a permanent installation? Undecided, he said. She left. Elias stood in the apartment in the quiet that followed her the way quiet always follows something large, and he looked at the synthesizer, and then at Petra's star chart still hanging at its uncorrected angle, and then at the student compositions on the music stand where Tomas's minimalist argument had been replaced by a new version that had, in fact, found its first instinct and followed it somewhere genuinely unexpected. He sat down. He played 3 notes. They sounded in the empty room like the beginning of something that had no particular interest in being rushed.